First and foremost, welcome everyone. Thank you very much for taking the time to join our third webinar in our webinar series this week for the NHSSCA giveaway. So I've got the pleasure to introduce Nick Garcia, who's the head strength and conditioning coach at Notre Dame High School in California. And today he's going to be presenting on his training methodology, how he trains his high school athletes at Notre Dame, and also how he uses output as part of that approach. So without further ado, Nick, thanks very much for your time. And yeah, really looking forward to the presentation.
All right. Thanks for listening, guys. Basically, I'm going to talk about what Cedric just said and how I use output in our training sessions. I'll give you kind of a background of how we set up our training sessions and the things that I think about and that go into those training sessions. So my program overview here. We got 3 cycles, okay, and they're theme cycles. The first cycle is called a volume cycle, and basically, like I said, I'll give you an outline of what we're doing. We got 5s on the power lift, so I define the power lifts as squat, bench, deadlift. The Olympic lifts, we're at 3s. The percentages we do, the intensities we do: week 1, 70, week 2, 75, week 3, 65, and week 4, 80. Now, the way the sets and the sets work, okay, so week 1 is 3 sets, week 2 is 5 sets. That's our volume week. Week 3 is our unload week, so we only have 2 sets. And week 4 is what we call our performance week. And we have only 2 sets there, but obviously intensity is much higher. Then we move into strength development in the next 4 weeks. 3s for power, 2s for the Olympics. And it follows the same concepts of sets, where we go 3 sets, 5 sets, 2 sets, 2 sets. But as you can see, the intensity changes as well here. Finally, we have our performance week, or for performance cycle, excuse me. And the power lifts follow the same type of pattern, but we do segment training on the Olympic lifts. So the first week we'll go 75% for 1 rep, 80% for 1 rep, 85% for 1 rep, and then we'll repeat that for another set or another segment, so if you will. And the program is just out there for you. You can see that. If you have any questions, you can feel free to ask me about that at the end there. As we move into peaking, we go 3x3 at 70 on the power lifts, 3x1 at 80%. And if we have a big competition coming up on a Saturday or a Friday, we'll typically do day 1 on a Sunday and day 2 on a Monday if the competition is on Friday. If the competition is on Saturday, we'll do day 1 on Monday and day 2 on Tuesday. And then we'll have a 3-week rotation in maintenance that we'll just keep repeating every 3 weeks. We change it. And this has been tried and true for me, especially for my shot put discus throwers, my throwers in general. We always throw far at the right times and at the biggest meets of the year. Furthermore, what I want to add to that is that you'll see you have an unload week and a performance week. Week 3 of the cycle is always an unload week. Week 4 is always a performance week. So when I'm there, that's kind of a checkpoint of, okay, when we unload, how are they going to react? When they're under low volume but high intensity, how they're going to react. So there are checkpoints to make sure what we're trying to accomplish is actually taking place. So when we do get down to that prep week, I know how they're going to react and what to kind of expect as far as their performance level goes. We just talked about this: weekly themes: base, volume, unload, and performance. So we have both cycle themes and weekly themes. Daily themes. I'm a real big train on all 3 planes guy. So we'll train on the sagittal plane, frontal plane, transverse plane. Occasionally, depending on what team I'm working with, we'll have a sagittal based day, a frontal plane based day, and a transverse based day. So what does that mean? So sagittal pretty much is our heavy day, because most of the lifts that take place on the sagittal plane are typically heavier. You can't move as much weight on a frontal or transverse plane. So our cleans will take place on that day, our heavy squats, whatnot. On our frontal plane day, we might do some lateral step-ups. We might do lateral lunges, some kind of banded speed skater for an explosive movement. And then on the transverse base day, you have your rotational lunges. You have your jammer rotations if you have jammer arms, landmine type stuff, explosive movements. So we try to have those type of themes in our training, because that's how sport takes place, is on all 3 planes of movement. All right, so let's start talking a little bit about the velocity-based part of my training. So speed is quantified by time. Strength is quantified by how much weight is being performed. Okay. Just because two athletes are moving the same amount of weight does not mean they are producing the same amount of power. I have two kids who may clean 130 kilos, but one is moving that bar much faster than the other individual, and therefore producing more power. Okay, what is it? Okay, basically it's using a device to measure the velocity of the bar when performing movements. In this occasion, it's obviously output. The device I use is output. So we use average velocity and peak velocity. Average velocity is primarily used with powerlifting movements, the squat, bench, and deadlift. Okay, peak velocity used with the Olympic lifts. And why is that? Well, often, squat, bench, deadlift, they're a little bit simpler to perform typically, if everything's equal. With the Olympic lifts, kids have different impingements, poor flexibility, poor mobility, maybe the lats and the wrists, etc. They don't rack as well, which in turn will slow the bar down and affect the average velocity. So typically we'll use peak in that sense. Okay, we all have specific traits we are trying to develop when training athletes. Traits can vary from sport to sport: absolute strength, max strength, accelerator strength, etc. Strength, speed strength, and starting strength. And furthermore, you can train for these different characteristics throughout the year, depending on whether you're in season, out of season, or what you might classify as an off season. So there's different times where we train different characteristics here, and typically the absolute and max strength we don't do as much of. We're more into the strength, speed strength area, at least in my training plan. So I'm not the foremost guy on this subject. I use it all the time, and I feel I'm fairly good at it. But Brian Mann, those of you who may have heard of him, he's the guy, at least in the United States, that is kind of the expert in this area, and I've learned a ton of stuff from his books and from him personally. So this is kind of his first book that came out, and these are all mean velocities, and just kind of a basic template to go off of if you're trying to use mean velocity. So squat, you're moving dynamically 0.8 to 1.0. That's going to change if you're doing, absolute strength or max strength. But typically what we're trying to do athletic wise is we're trying to stay within that realm of dynamic movement and strength, speed strength area. Peak speed. Okay. There's just some newer, how do I say it? Speeds from his book, for peaks. So clean 1.55 to 1.85 meters per second, snatch 2.0 to 2.5, jerk 1.35 to 1.8. Now, typically, which if you look at it now, there's a lot of stuff having to do with height. So he may have different breakdowns based upon height. If you're between 5'6" and 5'10", you should probably be moving between this speed for each of these lifts. Like I said, check his books out. They're very, very good. I learned a ton of stuff from him. He's on many podcasts as well. So that's something to look at if you're definitely interested in velocity-based training. The former throws coach at USC, Dan Lang, they often use velocity-based training, and when they were hitting their maxes, they were hitting a very, very high peak speed as well, because they have very good technique. If your technique's not as good or not as stable, it might be all over the place. But if it's really good, even on your max lifts, you're going to have a very high peak speed. Here's another chart. Okay, you can look at it. Kind of breaks down the characteristics you're training for. So starting strength greater than 1.5 meters per second, speed strength 1.0 to 1.5, strength speed 0.75 to 1.0, and so on. Now, when you're getting into absolute strength, and you may be, let's say you're doing sets of 5, and that fifth set of 5, those last 2-3 reps, you start getting down to the 0.2 area, you should plan on probably failing the next 1 or 2 reps, because it's just kind of the way it works. And it's good in a sense where if you can stop yourself before you actually fail, you can save the nervous system a little bit of grief in a sense. So you don't completely tax the nervous system by failing. So why did I feel that velocity-based training became important? in one of Brian Mann's books, he talks about how he came kind of upon how important it actually is. They were doing a test, a study, and they wanted to see what affected the vertical jump the most. And he felt that, the clean would probably go ahead and affect that the most, meaning in a positive manner. And when they were doing them, they were doing really heavy and they were catching limbo catches, not good technique, etc. And it really had pretty much zero effect. He said that basically bench press had as much effect as a clean did on improving your vertical jump. So he figured either there is nothing to get from doing cleans as far as the vertical jump goes, or we're doing it in the wrong manner. And as soon as they started doing it for velocity-based stuff for speed, it definitely had a correlation, and their vertical jumps improved significantly from the time they were doing it for speed rather than doing it for just absolute type strength movement type stuff. So for prevention of failure, I kind of just mentioned that. Like I said, if you're getting down into 0.2, 1.15 or something like that, you're about to fail. So if you could shut that down before you actually fail, you will save your nervous system a little bit of grief. And so you're not completely, taxing the nervous system for the next day or the next training session. And let's all remember that if you're not an Olympic weightlifter, the most important thing is your sport. So whether that's volleyball, baseball, football, track, swimming, etc., we want to be good to be able to practice for our sport, and we don't want to be completely taxed from the weight room. We want to use it as a facilitator of movement to improve our performance, but we don't want it to completely destroy us so we can't train for our sport. Okay, obviously, I use output. This is Kalfani Muhammad using the output metrics, and you can see in the background the iPad. Kalfani is a sprinter. He ran 10.18 in high school and 20.67. He's been in the NFL for a number of years, and now he's out and is training for the Olympics for Puerto Rico. And so typically the way we train with him is he has a meet this weekend, and we start a new cycle of training, and we're in our volume week. And unfortunately, he wanted to compete during our volume week. So what we did was we trained hard day one, and now day two of lifting, we train for velocity-based in a velocity-based manner. So we won't completely tax him and destroy his nervous system. So everything he was doing, he was trying to move extremely fast. And this is him moving 62 kilos here at 2.93 meters per second. He's only 160 pounds. And not to mention there's off blocks as well that start about mid-thigh. So that's a lot harder to get that bar movement from the blocks. Okay, so in Saley's book, Stress of Life, basically all stressors draw from the same pool. And this is just a quote from him. You have relationship issues, okay, your education, your school's tough, family issues, etc., nightlife, all this stuff needs to be taken account to as a coach. And oftentimes, we have kids that may be not completely committed and going out and staying out late or whatnot, or they may have a game the night before before that was really challenging, and we have a lift the next day and we want them to maybe lift at a certain percentage. Well, that percentage, let's say 85%, if they had a hard night the night before, depending on whether it's from a tough game or a tough night of doing things they weren't supposed to be doing, that 85% may feel like 110% to them. And if we make them train at 85%, we might, overtrain them and drive them into the ground. So velocity-based training helps with that. Okay. Power is the first thing to go when overtrained. So how do we use it actually? Okay. We auto-regulate the weight used by an athlete while weightlifting. So as of now, there are speeds that are based on percentages. So 85% has a kind of a speed range. And I tell them if I want 85%, I say I want between this speed range and this speed range, and we want to stay in between that area. Studies have shown that your mass can differ anywhere between plus or minus 17% each day. So one day, it may feel like, 82%, and the next day it might feel like 117%, right? Or 118%. So that's why the velocity-based speeds based on percentages are very good tool. Determine the athlete readiness or lack thereof. If your athlete is cleaning 100 kilos or snatching 100 kilos, and week 1 they're moving it at 1.5 meters per second, but week 6 they're moving it at 1.1 meters per second or 0.9 meters per second, then obviously they're a little beat up, and it might be an opportunity for you to change their training or back them off a little bit. So you can kind of tell their readiness based off their speeds of lifting. Determine the proper load for my athletes using the Bondarchuk system. So I use the Dr. Bondarchuk system for a lot of my track and field athletes. And every day we train at speed strength. And so if it's at 0.8 to 1.0, the speed strength area or the speed strength characteristic, then I'm going to set their speeds for their lifting at 0.7. So when they do hit peak form in 18 to 25 sessions, so wherever they end up hitting peak form at, they move into that speed strength characteristic. And the reason why I do it that way is because if we set their speed at between 0.8 and 1.0 and they hit peak form, they're going to be outside of that at 1.2 or 1.3 meters per second at peak form, and they're out of the characteristic we're truly trying to train. So I use it to set my speeds or set the weights for my athletes using that type of system. Okay, introducing the athletes to resistance training. Lots of times we have athletes who may try and go too heavy, or a lot of times go too light, and we say, okay, I want to between the speed, and they'll have immediate gratification or feedback, so to say, and they can see where they're at. And so if it's obviously above that speed that I want, then it's too light and they got to increase the weight. If it's below the speed that I want, it's too heavy and they have to lighten the weight. So it's a good tool all around, and this is basically how we use it in my program. Just like I talked about earlier, what is 80% of one rep one day may be 95% of one rep max another day due to life stressors. Okay. So I was off by a percentage, 18%. It can range on 18% on any given day. So this is Kylan Wilborn. Okay. I talked about a little bit of athlete readiness. Kylan Wilborn was a 63-foot high school shot putter, 62.11 3/4. And that week he threw that PR at the CIF championships. He was very much, his wattage was very much up during that week. And I know Ryan Krauser's was, the first time he won the Olympic gold, his wattage was up as well when he was using the device measuring how many watts he was producing while he was lifting. So Kylan Wilborn was a very explosive athlete regardless, but he's most explosive during this time. So this was a number of years ago. I've been using velocity-based training for a number of years. And, like I said, I use it a very simple way, but it's very effective for the way we do it. So like I talked about, Dr. B system, speed strength every day, relies heavily in data. So like I said, if the goal is 0.8 to 1.0 meters per second, we will set at weight at 0.7 meters per second, ensure when we hit peak performance, we will be in the range of 0.8 to 1.0. Like I talked about, introduction to resistance training, okay, males, females in PE classes, lots of times, you have athletes who may not be familiar with the weight room, and, setting the speed rather than telling them what weight to do is much more beneficial. Like I said, if the speed is too high, then they have to go ahead and lower the weight, or increase the weight. And if it's too low, they go ahead and raise the weight. Okay, can replace percentages like I just talked about a little bit. Okay, there's also things called velocity-based profile of your one rep max, and that could be a little time consuming. And the reason why it can be time consuming is because basically the athlete has to max, and then you take whatever their max is, take 95% of that. That's their speed for 95%. Take 90% of it. That's their speed for 90% as they're going through the training session. Here are the ranges for back squat, front squat, and bench press that you kind of want to be in. 100%, 0.35, okay, front squat, 0.27, bench press, 0.15, and so on. So you take a screenshot of that. I believe that they're recording this as well, so you can look at it in the future. Studies have shown that in a strength program, the first year of training, explosiveness improves. However, throughout the next years of training, strength improves, but power numbers, explosiveness does not. So, well, I don't know if you guys all know who Joe Kovacs is. He's a good friend of mine. There's a video of him going around squatting 800 pounds for a number of reps. And that year, his PR did not get better, even though he was stronger. So his strength got better, but his power didn't. So that's kind of an example. And it took a while for that strength to transfer. And, last year, the year before, last year, I believe he threw 73.6 or a little bit, or 75.6, excuse me, a little bit farther than that. And obviously he got better, but it took a long time for that to happen. By the time he did squat 800 for 10 reps or whatever it was. Okay, so it is theorized through prior results that best way in order to develop an athlete is accelerated strength, speed, and speed strength. Okay, that's obviously by Brian Mann. Okay, check out Brian Mann's book on VBT. So you can find me. We have a podcast on hammermedia.com, and that is done every 2 weeks. And you can contact me, Nick_G_Garcia at yahoo.com, my Twitter, my Instagram, etc. I will always get back to you within the day, unless it's a very detailed or complicated question. I like to answer all my emails very specifically and to make sure you get everything you wanted out of it. So if it's a very detailed answer, then it might take a day or two for me to get back to you, but I definitely will get back to you. And you're always welcome to come by and watch us train at Notre Dame. Right now, we're not as good in football as we once were, but we're very good in basketball. We're very good in baseball. Girls softball is doing a really, really good job. So, and don't get me wrong, football does a really nice job training. We're just not as Vern Gambetta says, it's not always the X's and O's, it's the Jimmies and Joes. So you need to have really good athletes to be successful. So take any questions if you have it. I know we went through that fast. I didn't want to take a bunch of your time, but I'd be happy to answer whatever I can.
Cool, Nick. Thanks very much for the presentation. Super interesting stuff, and yeah, great to get an insight into how you do things, both with the high school athletes, but also your pros and kind of your more adult athletes. For anybody with questions, we already have a couple, but if you have any questions, just write it into the chat at the bottom of your screen. You're going to see the chat icon. You can just click on that and write in any questions that you may have. So I'll just kind of start out with some of the ones that we already received. How would you recommend a coach to implement using technology in their high school facility if they haven't used any before? Like what would your starting point be?
Well, what I did when we started using velocity-based training, what I did is I have 18 racks in our facility, and the racks are based upon the level of lifters that the athletes actually are. So if they're very, very good athletes and they do a really nice job and I could trust them, there's a level of trust that goes with this, is I start them on it first. So for example, when we started using output devices, since it was a little bit different platform than what they were comfortable or used to, we would start with rack 1 and rack 3 and rack 5. And I would make sure I was within those racks the whole workout to answer any questions, etc., that they may have had. Or if there was any confusion or some kind of malfunction, I could go ahead and be there and make sure things were working right. And then once I had those guys dialed in, the next session, I would go to racks 7 and 9, then so on all the way up to 18. And then we are all up to speed. And that's basically how I implemented the technology in our facility. I'm very much a perfectionist, so I need to make sure that everything's running right and working perfect before we kind of roll it all out. So I start testing it out with, rack 1 and 3 and 5, and then we move on once they understand it. If they have any feedback from me that, coach, we should probably try and do this better or do this better, then I listen to them and we'll implement that as we go on throughout the racks. So that's my way of doing it. And there's other ways doing it, but that's the way I've done it, and it's been successful for us.
Cool. No, that makes sense. Then on to the next question then. So what tweaks do you make to your program to cater to different needs between different sports? So not just kind of methodology wise, but also maybe, in how you use the technology.
How I use the technology? Well, like I said, it's a technology thing too. There's a bit of trust involved, because you have to know that these athletes that you're trusting to use these devices are going all out each time, and they're not trying to sandbag or manipulate the speeds and whatnot, so that's number one. But the way I adjust is, I can't say I do it velocity base wise. I do it based off the sport. So let's take football, for example. Let's take volleyball, for example. Football has to move 300-pound people around, and volleyball doesn't have to do that. So the type of explosive movements we're doing may be more so not as aggressive with the volleyball athletes as they are with the football athletes. Like, it's not necessary for them to go and do like heavy snatches or heavy cleans. So we might do heavy one-arm snatches, or we may do a landmine rotational snatch or a jammer press, something along those lines. We also, I've gotten away from doing overhead lifts with football guys. And so we do more jammer presses because I have jammer arms on each of my racks. But for volleyball, we'll do jerks and we'll do push presses and things like that, because they go up to block and they go up, outside hitters and et cetera. So they're very much an overhead athlete. So we do very much overhead things. Another way I've talked about in the past about adjusting training is, if you take, let's say basketball, for example, they're very much, they're playing all three planes all the time. They don't have to necessarily move 300-pound guys like football guys do. So we'll have themed days where we have a sagittal day, like I talked about, a frontal day, and a transverse day. And within basketball, we may have our sagittal day where we're doing heavy front squats or heavy back squats or speed-based front squats or back squats. But another day, on our frontal plane day, we may be doing lateral lunges only, or lateral step-ups. And on our transverse-based day, we might be doing rotational lunges. In football, we don't do as much of that stuff. We have a transverse, sagittal, and frontal plane based day, but they'll do that more so as far as core goes. Or, they might be on a transverse day, they'll do a twisting core. On a frontal plane day, they'll do a kettlebell windmill or a half kneeling windmill. Sagittal based day will be, an ab wheel or something, sagittally abdominally based. And the reason for that is, like I said, they have to move heavy people. So they have to, squat heavy, front squat heavy, hex bar deadlift heavy, et cetera. And the basketball, volleyball type players don't necessarily have to do that. And so that's the way I tweak our training is based upon the demands of the sport. And so I recommend that if you are a strength coach, that you go out to every sport you work with, you go out to water polo, you go out to golf, you go out to, wherever else, to get a feel for how that sport works. And you adjust your training based on what their demands of the sports are during the actual game of play.
Cool. Yeah. Nice in-depth answer. I'm just looking at the time now. So what we'll do is we'll just do one more, Nick, and then obviously want to be conscious of your time too. The last one then is, it's kind of like a general question, I guess. So obviously you're using, velocity-based training in terms of feedback, and obviously to guide, the loading, I guess, or the strength qualities that you want to be addressing. How kind of historically have you seen it influence like the intent of the athlete? Like, how, like, have you seen kind of, really like marked like behavioral changes as a result of using, VBT or just technology in general? And yeah, just to kind of get your thoughts on that.
Well, the competition aspect is probably the most important part, because, now these days we're all about immediate gratification. We want to see right now what's happening. And when one athlete sees a guy move 80 kilos at, 1.5 meters per second, the individual next to him is going to want to move that at 1.6 meters per second. So obviously the intent has been raised. The way they're lifting with intent has been raised. So in a sense, that is the most effective way I've used it in there, or it's been used, or the best characteristic of using velocity-based training in the weight room is the competition aspect, because, like I said, they're racked based according on their skill levels for the most part. And the reason why I do it that way, there's a number of ways you could do it. The reason why I do it that way is because the athletes with higher skill levels, I don't need to manage as much. And I could be in the group area where the kids who need more coaching on their lifts, I could be there more often while trusting the kids with higher levels of lifting experience. So the speeds go up. Baseball, it's a big deal. Like the pitchers train together, and when they're training together, and one athlete moves their safety squat at 140 kilos, and it's 0.8 meters per second, the next guy's going to say, well, I'm going to move 150 kilos at 0.95 meters per second. And so that is the biggest aspect, because they get everything out of it. And if you're doing it right, you ask them afterwards, okay, well, we didn't train maximally today, but you moved it as fast as you could on every rep. Are you more taxed now or more taxed when we, are training maximally? And they'll always say, if they're doing it right, that they're more taxed after training every rep with the intent to move it as fast as possible.
Makes sense. No, cool. Yeah, thanks.
If there's more, I can take more. If there's noise in the background, I'm speaking out of the conference right now. So if there's noise in the background, that's why. I apologize for that. But if there's any more questions, I'd be happy to take more.
Cool. Yeah, there is one more, and obviously, like from our perspective, it would be nice to hear your thoughts, because we've just released the feature that's being asked about. So what's your take on velocity drop-offs? I saw Output have this feature. Is this something that you use, and how do you use it if so?
Well, I haven't used that feature per se. What I like to do is, when I start using something new or unfamiliar, I like to really understand all the details about it first, and then I move on to the next thing that they drop out, or the next detail that they add. But as far as velocity drop-offs, I've used them in the past. I've seen them in the past, but I'm not necessarily concerned 100% with that. And for example, if I set the speeds for the baseball guys doing hex bar deads at 0.6 to 1.0, and their last two reps are at 0.58 and 0.59, I'm not gonna lose my mind about that. But if they have a significant drop off, then I say, okay, we got to adjust and whatnot. So hopefully that answers your question. I know it's not that detailed, but like I said, I don't have a ton of experience doing it in that manner.
For sure. No, that's really helpful. Thanks, Nick. We do have, could you maybe just bring up your socials slide again, just so that people can contact you?
Let's see here.
Yeah, and then we do have one more question from Robert, so I'll read that out once you got that up on the screen. Yeah, super. That's the one.
Are there any other slides that anybody else wanted to see? Maybe like this one.
Well, I mean, just so that everyone knows, we're actually going to be sending out a follow-up email with the recording of the webinar. Okay, so obviously, if you did miss out on screenshotting something, or if you want to check out, a slide in particular, you'll be able to kind of access that in the recording too. So no stress there. So Nick, are you still good?
Send me an email. I'll send them out to you guys. It's not a big deal.
Cool. Are you still good for one more question? That's all right.
Sure.
Cool. All right. So with the example of your PE strength classes or working with beginning girls sports, do you implement VBT right off the bat once they are proficient with the movements? Or do you start with kind of more linear periodization approaches and then move into VBT?
We start with more linear periodization approaches. I have a foundation phase that we do, and my foundation phase is based upon dumbbells and kettlebells and body weight. And so we do a bunch of pulling movements with the kettlebells and the dumbbells. And then from there, we have a work capacity phase. So the first phase will last 4 weeks. The second phase in PE class will last 4 weeks, and that's the work capacity phase. And that's the complexes and leg circuits where they're still pulling and pressing with dumbbells and kettlebells. Then we move on to during that time, those second 4 weeks, is those workouts don't take as long because they're complexes and leg circuits. So they're very intense, but they get done very quickly. So I microdose teaching Olympic lifting and the standard lifts after we get done doing our workout. So we may do our dumbbell complex or leg circuit, and day one, we'll do a clean progression. Day two, we may do a jerk progression. Day three, we may do a snatch progression. So by the time the 8 weeks are over, they've got their work capacity in, number one. Number two, they all are pretty proficient in doing their Olympic lifting, especially because of all the pulling we've done the last 8 weeks. Moving into weeks 9 through 12, we start with a more linear approach from there. And then once they have the next 8 weeks of that more linear approach, then we'll start implementing that type of stuff.
Cool. Thanks, Nick. Yeah, that's a really useful useful answer, because yeah, it's sometimes tough to know where to start, especially, you know, when you've got kind of inexperienced athletes kind of coming through the door. So that's really valuable. Thank you. So I'll just kind of wait another 30 seconds to see if anybody has any questions. But I think it looks like we're all wrapped up, Nick. So obviously, you know, I just really want to thank you again for your time, for your presentation, and yeah, obviously giving us your thoughts and insights. Always really great to hear how you do things and your thoughts on things. Like I mentioned to everyone, that we're going to be sending out the webinar as a recording and a follow-up email, and obviously thank you very much for your time and for everyone joining, and hope that you got a lot out of the presentation, and yeah, we look forward to following up with you. So wishing everyone a good afternoon, good evening, depending where you are, and thanks again. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, guys, for listening. And you know, I got good at doing things on Zoom over COVID, like presentations, and I'm a little rusty now, so I apologize for that. I'm better at doing it in person now, so it goes back and forth. So like I said, I'll send you all the slides. You had any questions, fire them away at me. I think I already got one. So thanks for listening, and good luck.
Thanks, Nick.